Hello, everybody.
Charles, I think you're gonna have to turn this up in my headphones.
I wouldn't have it any other way, buddy.
That's the good stuff.
That is the good stuff. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is episode 3 of the Friends Talking Fantasy. Almost got the name of the show wrong. Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. I am Charles, and with me today is Mr. Dylan.
Yeah, nailed both the name of the podcast and my name.
That's right. Really exciting episode planned for you guys today, but before we jump into it, let's go ahead and just get rid of some house cleaning items here. We listened back to episode 2 and we liked it, but there's a few things that we want to kind of change going forwards. We both kind of felt like the episode at an hour and 40 minutes was pretty long. So we're setting a new objective to have episodes between the 50-minute to 70-minute time frame.
That's our sweet spot.
That's the sweet spot, I would agree. And I think what's going to help us going forwards also is review of reviews will be back by popular demand. We will continue to do it, but they're demanding it, and to give it the love and attention it deserves and the time it deserves without feeling like we have to keep it into a 70-minute conversation while also talking about a book that we've just read. We are going to separate it, and we're going to spin off review of reviews into its own midweek episode that we will record after we finish reading a new book. So we'll read the book, we'll have an episode dedicated to the book, and then we'll have a midweek bonus episode of review of the reviews. So that should help space things out, keep runtime short, and have more content for you guys. So I think that's going to be a great way to format the show going forwards. Nailed it.
For real that time.
Yeah, that was the good stuff. A couple other things that I wanted to clarify from our last episode 2. We talked about Mistborn, the Final Empire. Something really quickly I heard in the re-listen of the episode that I had to just address. We talked about the quote that Vin and Sazed were talking, and Vin said, in context of Kelsier, "But we knew him. He was no prophet or god. He was just a man." And then Sazed said, "So many of them are, I think." And we were talking about the religious themes, and we were talking about Kelsier's story arc. But what we didn't talk about, the whole reason I picked that quote was because it was foreshadowing the true nature of the Lord Ruler. So I got this. It was working on the 3 levels there, and we just never talked about the foreshadowing elements in that quote. And I was frustrated with myself because that's the whole reason I picked that quote in the first place. So yes, we read that line and we picked up the foreshadowing. We just got swept away in conversation and forgot to mention it. So that was bothering me. I'm glad I got to air that out. And the last thing is there is indeed a 4-year age gap between Vin and Ellen. I looked it up. 4 years.
Checked it out, huh?
And at the beginning of Final Empire, she is 16 and he is 20. And in the Wells of Ascension, it's 2 years later, which puts her at 18 and Ellen at 22, which starts to enter the realm of acceptable. It's still a little weird. 4 years is not that big of a deal, but I think you got to be like 21 and 25 it would be a little more acceptable. Anything younger than that, it's, well, who am I to judge? You know, they're in love, they're happy, so good for them. I just wanted to. We weren't sure last time, and we're sure this time. 4 years.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I think she turned 17 during the course of the first book, and I think that it makes sense that Ellen may have been 21. I think the first book is 8 months, so we might have been 20 and 21. So we could both be right there, Charles.
We could be, but that's not what this was about. This was just about determining the actual age gap, which was 4 years. So that does put Mr. Venture at around 20. So
I feel like this is about you telling me that he was 20 because I think that's what you said.
That does happen to be what I said. Yes, my instincts were pretty good on that one, but it is possible that there could be that this took place in that few months of overlap where there's not a whole year's difference between their ages, but I that wasn't expressed explicitly in Sanderson's writing, so it's up to the reader's interpretation.
I'm going to come back with our next episode, and this time it'll actually be on point to the episode's topic with a quote, because I'm feeling pretty confident that it's established that Elend is 21 at some point. But
well, he's 21 at some point. 2 years
I think
take
it's explicitly mentioned in book 1. I think that there's a scene where Vin says that Elend is twice her age, and during that, she's joking, of course.
Right.
But during that scene, I think it's established that Elend is 21 by that point. It is later in the book. So
well, you have to establish that Vin is not at that point 17.
We'll figure it out next episode.
I'm just saying, there's a 4-year age gap. That I know for sure. At what age they were at certain times in the story, I can't say. That we'll have to go back.
The point is the age gap, and it just so happened that the numbers you present had you as the one who's right. That's the story of this.
That's the story. And also, we're bringing you, the listener, the cold hard facts. I think it's important that we don't leave our listeners wondering what the age gap of Vin and Elend is. I think it's important that they know that it's a 4-year age gap, and that Vin at the beginning, when they first met each other, Vin was 16 years old. I think those are important facts.
Yes. And Elend in his 20s. Creepy.
Yes. And so, is that the kind of guy I'd want to marry? I don't think so, but
it was the kind of guy that Romy wanted to marry.
Yes. And I think we assessed Romy's review accurately in those respects. So,
Charles, one more thing I want to mention is from Romy's review. I think she says that she buddy read a review.
Yes.
And
she buddy read the book, not a review.
Sorry, buddy read. Yeah, we buddy read a review.
We did.
She buddy read the book with. She linked to she said with this girl and linked to another account. I feel like what you and I are doing when we go over the books, I feel like we're buddy reading.
We are buddy reading. Yeah, we are. We're reading the book in tandem with the purpose of discussing it later. I would call that buddy reading.
And we're buddies.
Yeah, and we are buddies, and we're reading books. It's I did like that about her review. That was a positive for me, and that was reflected in my final ruling of that review.
Your 2-star. Oh no, wait! I think you gave that one 3.
I don't. Who's to say what I gave it? At the time, it was good. It was accurate.
Yeah, look for Charles to come back during our next podcast to clarify that one.
Dude, I don't know. You can just go back and listen to the episode to clarify it. The review was pretty rock solid.
True.
All right. Well, today's conversation, let's just jump right into it. Today, we are talking about characters, fantasy characters that we like a lot. That is the conversation for today. We're talking about some of our favorite characters in fantasy.
Nailed it.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to get into this.
So I think we should do this, but I think we should just trade off. So we each picked 3 characters. We challenged ourselves with the question, Marsh, you want to kind of remind us of what that question was?
It
was your idea.
Broad strokes question was, what do you look for in characters? And then we sought to find just 3 characters apiece that exemplify what we like about characters. And it was a hard exercise for me anyway. I imagine it was hard for you.
Yes. It's a lot of pressure to pick like your top 3 just characters across all of fantasy. It's almost an impossible task, but we can get
It's
a
huge ask.
Yeah.
And I think part of what had to happen was just picking what seemed to fit with exemplifying what we want to exemplify, and knowing that there's going to be some characters that we both love that don't make the list.
Yeah, don't think of it as like a top 6. Just think of it as characters that masterfully reflect an example of something that we appreciate in characters.
Yeah.
I think, would you do us the honors of naming your first character?
Oh, yeah. Well, do you want me to get into a little of how I was thinking about the question of what
I think maybe when we announce each character, we'll re-answer the question at the top. So when it's now that it's your turn, what do you look for in a character? You answer it in the context of this character, and then you reveal the character, and then we discuss.
All right. Well, I want to be able to get across. I do have a theme that goes across my characters, and that is that I tend to enjoy morally gray characters. I find if you give me just a straightforward hero who's a paragon of moral virtue, then I'm probably going to get bored with that person. I think that if you give me someone who toes that line, you're not really sure if they're a good person or a bad person, then I think it gives us a chance to explore human nature better, because, none of us are perfect, and I think most of us exist more along those gray lines anyway. We all have capability for good and capability for bad, and I think that a character that shows this really well is Logan Ninefingers.
Yeah, no surprise that you picked him right off the bat.
Yes, so Logan's probably, I know we're not thinking about this as rankings, but if I had to, Logan Ninefingers from the first Law series by Joe Abercrombie would probably be my number 1 favorite character, and I think Joe Abercrombie does characters extremely well. I probably could have filled this thing out with exclusively Joe Abercrombie characters, but I refrained. Gotta get some variety in there.
I appreciate that. Trust me, I know your ability to just fill the conversation with Abercrombie-isms.
Yes, and I think one of the things that comes up for me with Logan Ninefingers, and maybe this moves a little bit away from the morally gray aspect of it, but something very unique about this character for me is this is a character that changed my life. Also something I like about characters.
That's a strong case.
Yeah, I mean, it's rare, I would say, that you leave a book of fiction really feeling like it's going to significantly influence your life. But I'd say Logan's adages that he throws around, his little truisms.
So you must have some prepared of like some of these isms, because you say he changed your life. I mean, that is such a huge statement, and I would just love to kind of get into more of the specifics of what exactly, because I agree, I think Logan Ninefingers is an amazing character, and he's definitely deserving to be at the top of anyone's fantasy characters list, but I'm more curious about the personal connection that you have with Mr. Ninefingers.
For sure. Well, I would say the primary way that he's changed my life is one quote that has stuck with me ever since I read it. And it's something he says over and over again, which is, once you've got a task to do, it's better to do it than live with the fear of it. and that is just absolutely beautiful. And I'm in academia. I'm pursuing my PhD right now, and I, for a very long time, still sometimes, but I've gotten a lot better, have dealt with procrastinating, and I would always just pull these all-nighters last minute to try to get things done. And I read this quote, and I was like, that's exactly what I needed to hear, because when I was procrastinating, I was like afraid of it. I was trying to avoid it, and I was doing something instead, and I wasn't enjoying the things I was doing. And I think Logan says, look, you got to do this thing. You know that. Might as well just do it. And honestly, it's changed my life, because I'm way more on top of things, and it's like a mantra for me. It goes through my head when I'm about to work on something. I think, look, once you got a task to do, it's better to do it than live with the fear of it.
So that's one of the things, like, what makes Logan Ninefingers such a beautiful character is that his like this whole idea of a character that is this barbarian philosopher. He makes these simple yet profound assessments of life, like, throughout the whole book, and he'll repeat some of them over and over again, and you're like, yeah, this guy, for better or worse, has it together. It's these simple isms that he utters that are so simple and yet so, like I said, so profound. It makes him a really, really interesting character. And then you combine that with his past. He's such a complicated guy. Like, he's philosophical, and he's usually pretty well mannered, but he has a long past of being this total brute and being totally violent and angry. So he still has that. Like, he would still break into these violent outbursts. So I think what adds to his depth is not only his ability to, like, be a profound philosopher while still also being a barbarian, but he's also has this complicated past, and that he's still working on throughout the series and throughout the first Law book, at least. And it's just such a fascinating character to read. It's so unique, and, like, one of the best things of those books is Logan Ninefingers, the character, by far. So really, it's a great pick.
For sure. Thanks. Thank you for getting across to that idea of Logan Ninefingers as this barbarian philosopher, basically, but he's got these concise statements that he gets across that you're like, yeah, that is so true. If I tried to say that, it would take me hours to try to get that across. I would be speaking in paragraphs, not in a simple phrase like that. And Logan is better than anyone at getting that across.
He's also so this good. Really interesting, like, throughout the book, he's often put into these, like, fish out of water scenarios too. Like, when he goes into the city for the first time and he sees all the, like, I remember, like, it's been years since I've read the books, but I remember a moment where he's in one of the main cities and he sees all these pipes and tubes, and he's trying to imagine that it was poop going through them, and it was like shocking him speechless to think about, like, all the pipe systems going on in that book.
Yeah, there's some great scenes during that. So I want to make sure I get to some of what I like about the morally gray aspects of Logan.
Sure.
Which are that he's got those truisms. I think that they have a dark side, though, that you can see how, in a lot of ways, he uses them to justify some choices that he's made in the past and continues to make. I think he's a character that you can think, and I'm going to give a little bit of a spoiler here, but if you've read the first book, The Blade itself, of the first Law series, and you're all good, he has this split personality, really, where he's got the Bloody Nine, who is almost like he's going into rage mode, or he is even possessed by a demon or something, but this incredibly violent, almost entirely different personality. You can see how the prose changes and everything like that, where all the Bloody Nine cares about is murder, and you can see this just shift. Logan can't even remember it. Mm-hmm. And what you're dealing with there is, I think, because we see this more mild-mannered, good person-seeming Logan early on in the series, the Bloody Nine comes out and we say, oh, he keeps talking about this bloody, awful past. All of that stuff must have been the Bloody Nine doing that. And this guy Logan that I've learned to love is just a good guy. And I think that Abercrombie actually uses that to lull you into a false sense of security with Logan. So you can say, oh, he is a good guy. And then
he's on this like redemption arc, you know, that's what you think he's doing. Like he has a violent background, then he's making good on his past kind of throughout the...
Yeah. And you see times where he's got this other adage, which is you have to be realistic about these things. He says that all the time. There's this call for pragmatism when he's in these rough situations. And there's a time in Before They're Hanged, which is the second book, where he says, a choice between killing and dying is no choice at all. You have to be realistic about these things. And,
right.
I think that does make sense, right? I feel a lot of people would rather kill than die. But if you take a step back from that, you see, wait, that is actually a choice. And there are people who would rather die than kill someone. But Logan just says, oh, you got to be realistic about these things. And he does what he sees as needs to be done. And I think he's got some parts of Logan Ninefingers himself that you can't attribute all the bad to the Bloody Nine.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I always knew you had a sort of affinity towards morally gray characters, and certainly Logan's character gets more complicated as we start to fall in love with him. I think Abercrombie picks great moments in the pacing of the story to add these kind of conflicting moments of Logan Ninefingers where he becomes the Bloody Nine. But I know we originally planned to alternate choosing characters, but I think we should just stick on this theme of yours and just go straight through all of your characters. I think it's I think we're on an interesting track. You want to just do the next one?
Yeah, I'll keep it rolling.
Keep it rolling.
Well, my next character is one that you probably don't know as well as you know Logan Ninefingers, because he's from a book series you haven't read yet.
Okay.
I'm going to in part use this as a pitch to see if I can get you to read The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, one that you're very well acquainted with.
Yes, it's on my list to read, yeah. But when I first started picking fantasy books to read, I didn't want to read anything that wasn't finished. I didn't want a Game of Thrones situation where I'm waiting years and years for the next book. But this has been at the top of my reading list for so long. I'm curious to hear more about. So did you pick Locke Lamora then? That's the character, right?
I did pick Locke Lamora.
That's the one character I know.
Nailed it again, Charles. So I think I have a quote about Locke Lamora, and I want to introduce him with it, which is, someday Locke Lamora, he said, and he is Father Chains, which is Locke's mentor character in this, someday you're going to fuck up so magnificently, so ambitiously, so overwhelmingly that the sky will light up and the moons will spin and the gods themselves will shit comets with glee. And I just hope I'm still around to see it. Oh, please, said Locke. It'll never happen. And that's in the first book, Lies of Locke Lamora. And I think...
Sounds like a very cocky individual.
Yes. I love these rogue-type characters. Every time I played Dungeons & Dragons, I've gotten right for playing as the rogue. I love his smarmy, too clever for his own good attitude, which is just, Locke Lamora is the quintessential example of, for me anyway, these rogue-like characters. He's funny, he's clever, and he's arrogant, and I think he's also, as the hero or maybe anti-hero of this book, he's actually got some really good parts to him too. So you get to see him really walk that line of being morally gray. He's got this amazing friendship with one of the other characters, Jean Tannen, and they play off each other extremely well, and they're care for each other, his care for the whole crew in that book. It's a thieving crew that cons people, and his care for all of them is really amazing too. So I absolutely love that character, and he and the book overall have amazing dialogue, and I absolutely love good, witty dialogue.
So how does a character like, because that quote you read, it sounds a lot like something that maybe Kelsier would say from the Mistborn series that we're reading. In what ways does, because I wouldn't consider Kelsier to be like a rogue character per se, and he's certainly not that profane, but they do seem to share that kind of swagger.
I think, well, Kelsier's, we didn't cover this in Mistborn. Kelsier's my favorite character in Mistborn, and I think also we didn't get to talk about it last time, but Kelsier, one of my notes when I was reading it was, Kelsier's a bad man.
he's not great.
Kelsier goes around killing nobles just because they're nobles. He's a pretty bad dude, and I think what you see about Locke, I think that makes him a rogue, where Kelsier, I don't know, I guess Kelsier's leading a thieving crew, but he never feels quite like the rogue archetype.
Yeah, I guess he's so against pure evil and he's so likable and charming as a person that it's kind of hard to think of him as a rogue.
Well, I think that's part of the rogue appeal, and I think you see that with Locke too, is that you almost overlook some of these awful things that they do because they've got this charm and this charisma. I think Kelsier does have that. I think he's almost too powerful is what makes him not seem like a rogue. The rogue character doesn't usually have magic powers,
right?
I would say. So I think you start to fit him in. He's almost like a superhero, and he's also a mentor. So I think there's a lot of things you don't think of when you think of a typical rogue, but yeah. Locke is, I would say, the go-to example in the fantasy genre if you like rogues, and I absolutely do.
That's awesome. I'm excited to read it, and I think we should read it soon. It's been at the top of my list for years. There's only one more book left in that series, right? Or am I going crazy? Is that?
No, there's more. There's planned to be substantially more. And I know you're big on wanting to read series once all the books are out, and I think that's totally valid, especially with a guy who's made some money off of his books already, so you don't feel like you have to buy it to keep this guy going or anything like that.
Right.
I think that it makes sense, but especially his first book, Lies Locke Lamora, I would say there's 3 so far, and I hate to say this, but it does get progressively worse. It's still good, but the first book is one of my favorite books in all fantasy. So it goes from maybe an A+ to then the next one's A-, B+, and then the one after that's B-. So
man, I just gotta get over my rules and read some of these books, because I don't know how we can carry on with a fantasy podcast if I haven't read some of these. Lies of Locke Lamora being at the top.
Well, you know, that's one of my ulterior motives in doing this podcast.
There's a whole ploy to get me to read this so we can talk about it. Well, that's a good play. I'd be okay with that. I'm sure we'll read it soon. But I guess that only leaves one character left for you. I'm curious to kind of hear why you picked this last one.
We're rolling right through this. Well, this last one holds a special place in my heart. I would call this character my first favorite character in fantasy.
Wow.
And that's, she needs no introduction, but it's Arya Stark from A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones.
I knew you were going to pick a Game of Thrones character, and for a while I was wondering which one you would actually pick. I'm curious to hear your case for Arya specifically over just a completely star-studded, amazing cast of characters in Song of Ice and Fire.
it's so hard, and I definitely felt the more I thought about it, the more confused I was trying to pick someone from this star-studded cast. I mean, George R. R. Martin also writes incredible characters with depth. He, of course, balances the morally gray line. I think Jaime Lannister comes to mind as one of the key characters that George does extremely well. That morally gray, he's got some roguish aspects to him too, in his smarminess. But I went for Arya because I wasn't going to overthink it, all said and done. I went with the character that when I first started watching Game of Thrones, you'll remember this way back, I guess in between the third and fourth season, I picked it up. And I really, really like Arya, and I think she's what appeals to me most about Arya, especially in those early few seasons or books, depending on how you're doing this, is you can tell she's someone who, at her core, is a well-meaning person. She cares about things like justice and truth. She's always calling Sansa a liar, and she wants things to be right. And you get to see as she experiences the awful world that is Westeros in terms of obviously an amazing world from a world building perspective, a rough world from a living in it perspective. And she has to deal with some terrible, terrible things. And I'll give a little Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones spoiler. I think most of our fans have probably read or watched this in some format. When Ned Stark, her father, dies. That's obviously this really traumatizing moment, and she has to go through a ton. And I grabbed a quote from when she's talking to Yoren. You remember Yoren?
Yes.
That's the guy from the Night's Watch who's trying to take Arya to the wall. He's having this conversation with her, and she just says, "I wish I was home," she said miserably. She tried so hard to be brave, to be fierce as a Wolverine and all, but sometimes she felt she was just a little girl after all. So Arya, as she's going through this transformation, is becoming more and more badass, and she is dealing with all these horrible things, and she's realizing, hey, I have to be violent, basically, to make it through this world. And you get to watch her mold and be changed by the characters around her, Yoren included. Of course, the Hound is another character that molds her. But what I really like, and I think this is, not to go off too hard, but I think this is a place where the show started to go awry in the later seasons with this character of Arya, is underneath it all, there's this like scared little girl who's been traumatized by this world and really wants to do good. And I think that's what always most appealed to me, is as you see her try to manage all this.
I mean, I think Arya Stark is a good pick, especially for you. Like, it's so interesting you started the top of this with the conversation of like gray characters. And for me, like, Song of Ice and Fire is like gray characters, the series. Like, every single character has done shitty things as well as good things. There's no like clear good guy, and that's kind of the point of the whole show. So it doesn't surprise me that your first love has gone on to influence like your future picks. And then I would say Arya is definitely one of the more roguelike characters in that whole series, especially on the TV show. They like made her full on rogue character. So Arya is a great pick, and I agree. What makes her so interesting is her kind of quest to kind of earn her independence and also, you know, become powerful. It's what starts off as revenge, but then turns into this idea of just finding her own identity and gaining her independence, which I love characters that are just trying to make their way and that don't get too bogged down in the BS of things like politics and like, you know, side emotions and things like that. And I really appreciate Arya for going out and doing her own thing, and her story gets so far removed from everyone else's characters. And to watch that parallel with Sansa, who kind of stuck with her upbringing and like went through the whole ringer of politics and everything, to like read them back and forth, you're like, man, Arya had it right that whole time. Like, because I feel like Sansa and Arya are like two like parallel universes of the same character, right? It's like, what if they stayed, what if they left kind of situation. And you can kind of see just like how different their lives took them. And I think that's what made Arya like one of the more interesting characters. She kind of didn't fit that formula of, like, noble young girl who's good at knitting and wants to marry the prince. It's like, no, she wants to sword fight, and she wants to, get into fights and protect people and travel the world. And it was just a really interesting kind of parallel.
Yeah, and you mentioned independence and autonomy as something that in the end of I think all of Game of Thrones is where she ends up. And I'm a believer that the way that Game of Thrones, the show, ends is the way that A Song of Ice and Fire will generally end in terms of how the character arcs end.
Right.
I know that's not proven anywhere or anything like that, but I do believe that that's probably where Arya ends up in A Song of Ice and Fire, the book series. And I think what happens with the show, where a lot of people didn't like or understand that ending, is that Arya just goes full on badass with no emotions at a certain point in the show.
Right.
And then when all of a sudden she's like, oh, I guess I actually don't care about killing the queen. I'm gonna go travel on a boat because the Hound told me. It's like, I think that if you stick to this idea that really underlying Arya is, and underlying this callousness that she's displaying is this scared girl, then I think you have a much better story. And I think the show neglected that side of Arya, because everyone's like, Arya's so badass, she's going around killing people. And I think what's cool about Arya early on in the show, and still in the book series, I would say, is that she's a real person underlying all of that. And I think if you maintain that and you still end up getting to this place where she is like, wait, no, that's not what all this is about. What is the point of getting vengeance? That's not going to bring anyone back.
Right.
Then we have a more satisfying conclusion to her arc. So I'm hopeful that in the book series.
I'm hopeful that George won't write her saying, "What's west of Westeros?" right before she leaves. I'm hoping
I don't
she
mind
says
that much.
I'm hoping
it's been memed.
I hope she's gonna say something a little more insightful than that.
Like,
she had some rough dialogue.
What's
that
east
season.
of Essos?
I know what a murderer looks like. Oh God, let's not get into it. But no, she's a great character. Maisie Williams did a great job.
Oh, so great
playing her. Like, I can't see Arya any other way except how Maisie Williams portrayed her in the show. It's just so brilliant.
Amazing. Well, I know we chatted briefly off the air. Are we on the air? Is that how I should refer to it?
That's fine. On the air, off the air, off the record.
Well, I'm fine with it being on the record. We chatted a little bit about the idea, what if we were casting Mistborn, something that we're inspired a little bit because the Legendarium podcast talked some about that. And
right.
We were very much in agreement that Maisie Williams would make a great Vin.
She would, because of this, really similar characters, like strong, young, slim build, black-haired women. I think she would fit the bill for sure. She's definitely got the looks. Well, so
Well, I was thinking that she does a good job playing this really good fighter as a young girl, and you buy into it. So I think that she finds a way to be intimidating while being just tiny, which is exactly what you need out of Vin.
Exactly. Well stated, sir. So that's it. That's your rogue-like gray morality characters for you. It's a great list.
I'm smiling over here because I didn't know that I'd have this much fun talking about it, but I'm realizing that asking me just talk about 3 of my favorite characters in fantasy is super awesome.
I know. These characters are so great, and it makes me want to reread because it's been so many years since I've read Logan Nine Fingers, and man, like you bringing back all these things, like that character was so good, like so epic.
Amazing.
And I'm excited to now go into my 3 characters. So I would say like this was, first of all, this episode was your idea. And when you first pitched it to me, I was like, oh God, like I have no idea how to answer this question. Like, who are my favorite characters in all of fantasy? Like, it's an impossible. I was very intimidated by the task, and especially going on record on this podcast as listing 3 of my favorites is very daunting. But
especially when there's over 600 point of view characters in Malazan.
I know. Who am I gonna pick in Malazan? There's so many choices.
I'm expecting at least 2 out of the 3.
Yeah, it was tough, man. It was tough, but I did kind of approach it as like the question helped of what do you look for in a character, and I think my 3 characters represent like whereas yours were very clearly all very similar. This gray morality roguelike kind of universe. Mine are, I think, 3 very different kinds of characters, but I think they're really strong examples. And I'm going to lead this off in a very ambitious pick. And this pick is in The Lord of the Rings, just like you had to talk about Game of Thrones and Joe Abercrombie. I had to talk about Lord of the Rings. And I could have easily filled this list with all Lord of the Rings characters, but I was like, you know what? I should pick just one that really stands out to me. And it was tough because there's just so many epic characters in that show. But I went for what I would consider the cult pick, but he's gotten a lot more traction now. I think everyone kind of recognizes this character as one of the best characters and certainly one of the most appreciated characters, and that character is Samwise Gamgee. Yes, wow. Friends, I picked him over Aragorn, over Gandalf, over Frodo, over Legolas, Samwise Gamgee. And it wasn't that hard of a pick for me because while Aragorn and Gandalf and all these characters are like obviously super epic and super popular, like Samwise for me wasn't. He kind of grew on me, like when you watch the movies and read the books, you're like, man, Legolas is badass, dude. He's shooting these arrows off. He's so cool. And like, Aragorn's killing all these. He's like fighting Ringwraiths with a flaming sword. That's badass. But you're forgetting that this whole time, like those characters are kind of built up to be like these superhero, do no wrong, epic lineage, totally like indestructible characters. But it's the hobbits that are kind of like you kind of put your personality into because they're the ones that are leaving their homes and facing danger and have no special skills whatsoever except their
just like us.
Exactly. Just at least I related to that in a very strong way. And so what do I look for in a character that made me pick Sam is an easy enough question. It's definitely this idea of having a poetic metaphor to your story arc. Like every main character is going to go through this long arc in a book or in a series. And for me, it's like when the moment comes towards the end where you've been with this character for so long, it's when he finally kind of fulfills his arc, and it happens in a way that's that's borderline poetry, and that's why I love Lord of the Rings so much. And I can see why Lord of the Rings didn't make the cut for you. One, because you didn't read the books, but two, because when you're pitching these gray morality characters, none of the characters in Lord of the Rings, except maybe the one you probably would pick, which is Sméagol, Gollum, a literally gray character that I would see you picking. Which you could argue is, he switches back and forth. But
Charles, I don't know if you remember though, when we watched those movies together before our New Zealand trip, I did say that Gollum was my favorite character.
I kind of remember making that joke. Like, of course, you picked the gray character, the literally gray character.
Yeah.
So I mean, Gollum's a great character. Also, like, all your characters are epic, but like Gollum was topping the list for me also. But I instead chose Sam, and I chose Sam because, to me, this idea of good versus evil has, since Lord of the Rings, has been played out to the point where now these gray, edgy characters even exist. I think it was kind of built on the established characters written in Lord of the Rings, right? So this idea of like true good and true evil. But what makes Sam so interesting to me is that he had such these humble beginnings, and he faced these challenges that were far greater and more terrible than he should have ever had to face in his life. And not only did he face them, but he faced them in a way that most of the other characters on the show never could. He flippin' like fought a giant spider and then stormed a tower inside of fucking Mount Doom, and then he took the ring from Frodo and then gave it back. The most terrible temptation in the world is the ring, and the fact that he was able to give it back to Frodo is such a beautiful moment. And then at the end, when he literally carries him up the last part of Mount Doom and into the fires, it's just such a...
And we know how hard a journey that is, Charles.
And as someone who has climbed Mount Doom, I've been there. I couldn't imagine carrying someone.
Would you carry... Yeah, Charles, could you imagine if when we were nearing the peak, you just had to carry me the rest of the way?
I can't carry it for you, Mr. Frodo, but I can carry you.
I imagine that would be the trail mix. Is the ring in I can't carry it for you.
Yeah, our cranberry cashew trail mix, because we're fancy.
Cranberry Delight.
Cranberry Delight, yes.
Yeah.
Man, that was a good
Never
shit.
forget that.
And,
that was... Yeah. I think that Sam's an awesome pick. Obviously, I think it's something that distinguishes our tastes pretty well. Is I think you pick the character that best represents I think a person with heroic character traits. Maybe not heroic abilities or anything like that, but person, when you look at the Lord of the Rings and you look at fantasy more generally, just becomes very clearly a hero, a heroic person.
He is the most heroic, just by his actions and by the evil that he had to face with the humble beginnings that he had. And you can make that case for all of the hobbits. They kind of all represent that same thing. But just the fact that Sam was the loyal friend to Frodo. Frodo was the star. He was carrying the ring and that burden, and he's kind of grouchy all the time. And Sam was keeping him up and moving. It was a very selfless act. And then when he thought Frodo was dead, and he took over the responsibility of ring bearer, and still like tried to do right by Frodo and went back and figured out he was alive and fought for him. It was truly a touching moment. And I think the whole point of Lord of the Rings is to kind of get back to that idea of camaraderie and of friendship. And I think a lot of Tolkien's inspiration for writing these stories is rooted in Sam and Frodo's friendship. So I think Sam really drives the spirit of the books, and it's just such an amazing character. And at the end of the books, he gets some of the best lines. Like, I could read some of these quotes, but they're so long, but they're so epic. Just Google Samwise Gamgee quotes and just kind of bask in that poetry. But it's really just a really special character, so that's why I chose him. And like, another thing for me about Lord of the Rings and why I think modern fantasy has taken such a departure, it's like Gandalf and Legolas and Aragorn, it's like they all have these like super epic weapons, and they're all lineage of super important people, and they have all these great powers, and it's and they do no wrong, and everybody loves them, and they get into all these crazy adventures, and they interact with all the most important people in the world, and it's like, okay, like, we get it, they're super epic. It's just nice to see a more humble character go through similar features. And a little fun fact about Sam, he had, after he came back, spoilers, they throw the ring into Mount Doom and he goes home, he had 13 kids, and was mayor of the Shire for 7 consecutive 7-year terms. Did you know?
Wow. I didn't know that.
I mean, that would be interesting. You got to have some balls to run against Samwise Gamgee for mayor on his, like, 6th term. It's like, it's not possible.
Do you know if he ran for an 8th term, or did he decide not to run after 7?
I don't know, but I would imagine that the dude was unbeatable and he just retired. That would be my guess, but I honestly don't know. So that was my first pick, and that's my only Lord of the Rings pick, although I could have easily filled them with Lord of the Rings characters. My next one, of course, now is a Game of Thrones pick. So not a wholly original list here, but I mean, I'm picking them for a reason. All these characters are the best works. They're hard to beat. I feel safe in these picks also. So
Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones does feel pretty safe. I don't think you're going to get a lot of backlash.
Just try and debate me. I think these are fair. And while I think Arya is a good pick, I think there's a character that's just vastly better in terms of interest. I didn't know it'd
get competitive in here.
It's not. You make a good case for Arya, and I think that was a good pick for your list of characters and your approach. But what do I look for in a character? Going back to that question, and another thing that I love in characters is their intrigue, their complications, then their engaging relationship dynamics. And when characters have these interesting, compelling dynamics, it just brings so much life to the narrative, and all of a sudden you're reading the book a lot faster and you're burning through pages, and there's plenty of chapters in Game of Thrones that move slower than others. So, but every time this character's chapters come up, the page is just always burned by. And this character is none other than, of course, you know him, you love him, Tyrion Lannister. I thought you were gonna pick Tyrion Lannister. I really did. I was almost not gonna pick it because I was like, Dylan's gonna pick it. So, but then I checked you. I was like, dude, are you picking Tyrion? And you said you were. He's like, we had this conversation. He's like, well, who's gonna do it?
Me in the middle of overthinking.
Because we were like, who's gonna do it? You know, someone's got to do it. But we were trying to find room for him. You wanted to do Arya Stark, so I was like, okay, that's fair. There's really no other character I would want to do, except maybe another character, Tywin Lannister. But the reason I picked Tyrion is because of his relationship with Tywin. Those early back and forths are so amazing. I'll never forget when I was reading the first book, Game of Thrones, and like right in the beginning, Tyrion and Jon are talking, and Tyrion just drops this, Jon's being like, oh, I'm a bastard, nobody likes me. And then Tyrion drops this line. He's like, all dwarves are bastards in their father's eyes. And I was like, oh, so good. God, this character is amazing. And so already he's got my interest level, right? Like, he's already a unique character being a dwarf. And you give him this huge level of intellect and this huge personality, and he's dropping all the best lines in the series by far. Like, it was no surprise to me when I found out later that it was George's favorite character and the one he channels a lot of his own personality through. And I was like, well, that makes a lot of sense. This character has that layer to him that is so unique and special that it had to just come right out of the author. And I get a lot of that reading Tyrion. And when I'm going back to this engaging relationship dynamic, like, oh my God, Tyrion and Tywin is such a brilliant pairing, you know? And I'm going to parallel it to what we're reading in Mistborn, but there's an amazing couple quotes I'm going to read really quickly. There's the one where Tyrion is on trial in King's Landing, which is so good, and Tywin's holding court. And Tyrion's like, I'm guilty of far more monstrous crime. I'm guilty of being a dwarf. And then Tywin goes, you're not on trial for being a dwarf. And Tyrion goes, oh, yes, I am. I've been on trial for that my entire life.
So
which
good.
is another amazing line. And then I think earlier on, there's another Tywin-Tyrion relationship where I think Tyrion's like, yo, you're going to give me Casterly Rock when it's time? And Tywin just drops this amazing line. He's like, you are an ill-made, spiteful little creature, full of envy, lust, and low cunning. Man's law gives you the right to bear my name and display my colors, since I cannot prove that you are not mine. And to teach me humility, the gods have condemned me to watch you waddle about wearing that proud lion that was my father's sigil and his father's before him. But neither gods nor men will ever compel me to let you turn Casterly Rock into your whorehouse. Bro.
Wow.
I read that. And then, like, to be reading Wells of Ascension with Ellen talking to his father, I'm like, not even in the same stratosphere. Like, it's a similar relationship dynamic where the father and son hate each other, and the son is kind of rebelling by acting out and trying to. Then it gets to the point where they try and play politics with each other. But I mean, that dialogue is unbelievable. And
oh yeah, I mean, George just writes these lines that
waddle about.
Stop you.
I love that.
Just stop you dead in your tracks. And just hearing, it's been a little while since I heard that Tyrion quote. So good. I also picked out a Tyrion quote when we were exchanging those texts because.
Drop it on me. We're in the Tyrion segment.
So I think this this actually immediately precedes the all dwarves are bastards in their father's eyes quote, which is, he's talking to Jon Snow. Oh, never forget what you are, for surely the world will not make it your strength, then it can never be your weakness. Armor yourself in it, and it will never be used to hurt you. And that's
another great line.
Dynamite. I mean, there's, especially early on in Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire, there are just these lines that it's like, holy crap, I cannot believe you just dropped that. And Tyrion has a bunch of them. And I'm so glad you talked about his relationship with Tywin, because
that's the best part of the whole
amazing
series.
Dynamics
I would probably pick Tywin as my favorite character if Tyrion did not exist, you know. But that's the whole thing. Like, their relationship drives so much of the early story, and I love it so much. And you can relate some of Tyrion, like Tyrion to Logan, in that they have these kind of isms that they drop that set the tone of the whole series, you know. Like, Logan drops those pretty awesome philosophies, and Tyrion's not afraid to philosophize on crazy stuff all the time. So those kinds of characters, the postulating ones, do tend to be more interesting than, say, like the straight hero or the straight villain who doesn't kind of challenge their own thoughts and get into these kind of debates with themselves, these philosophical debates. And like,
Tyrion fits well with. I almost went with him because he totally could have fit well with the morally gray characters theme that I was going
and even
for.
Like the self-preservation rogue-like kind of aspects of him, and also he gets a little bit into that charming aspect that rogues have too.
Yes.
Like, he does dip into all of that, but he's injected so much with his own personality that it's hard to put him into any kind of a trope.
He's his own character for sure. I think there's some honorable mentions in terms of Tyrion having great relationships with others. That I think Tywin's number one, but we'd be remiss not to mention how great his relationship is with Varys for one. I mean, talking about philosophizing when those two are talking about power, and Varys is giving his Mummer's Trick speech about power. I don't have that one in front of me, but they basically says that power resides where I think men think it resides, is how it goes. And it's such a great exchange. Those two have an amazing dynamic.
Well, yeah, I mean, Tyrion's dynamic with everybody is so interesting. I just think it's a facet of his character. He's able to reach an understanding with every single character he meets, and he's able to kind of develop a connection. He doesn't get really too much wrapped up in politics or hate or anything like that. Like, he feels all of those things, but he pretty much makes deals with every single person on the show that he meets, and he tends to like everyone that he meets. And it's so different from most of the show. Everyone's kind of dividing into political factions, and I always liked Tyrion because he was able to understand different characters and get these really interesting interactions out of them and make me like those characters more, because it's like he's taking the time to put the BS aside and make a connection. And so the characters that he's more likely to connect with, just it makes that whole character that much more interesting. And I think that's why Tyrion is one of the best characters, and because I think that way too. It's like, dude, I don't really care like what we're opposing ideas, but I would much rather find some way to connect with you and work together than necessarily be at odds with each other and diss each other subtly all the time, like backhanded disses constantly.
For sure.
It's like yes, let's acknowledge that exists, but let's also have a constructive conversation. And that's kind of Tyrion's motto, and that's what kept him alive for so long. I would say.
When you said he doesn't get involved in politics, obviously he gets involved in the political machinations, but he doesn't get involved in the lower level, almost office politics.
Right.
If you will.
Like, he gets very involved in politics as the hand of the king and all of that, but he also doesn't, in that he doesn't recognize the formality of it, and he likes people for people, and he's interested more in the ideas of things, and he makes the effort to connect. And he also, shuts down, and he's out. It's really, he's just fantastic character. But my third pick, I could spend a whole 60 minutes talking about Tyrion. We'll have to have a separate Game of Thrones discussion, because
I love to do that.
I love Tyrion.
Game of Thrones
so much.
Characters.
Yeah, we'd have to reread. I'd have to do more research. But man, we could just exchange quotes the whole time, because his words are poetry. I could read Tywin quotes all day long.
Top Game of Thrones quotes could be an episode.
That's right.
Charles, you're nailing it.
What can I say? I'm on to my next pick, though. This pick is going to stray a little bit from the formula. It is still a basic bitch choice, but in not so basic of a medium. I'm going into the world of graphic novels. Of course, I'm choosing one of the more popular modern graphic novels out there, if not the most popular. But what do I look for in a character, you might ask? Well, with this particular character personifies the thing I perhaps care about most in a character, and that is their realism and their believability, their diverseness, their complications. Like, so many times, especially in a Lord of the Rings thing, it's like Aragorn is good. He's the king. He leads men. Everyone likes him. He has no problems. He doesn't get into fights. He doesn't get into relationship problems. His relationship problem is oh, I love an immortal elf princess. What am I going to do?
That happens.
It's not
always getting caught up in that.
I really want to make out with this other chick because she's hot, but I'm with her. It doesn't get like that. It doesn't get complicated. It's very much this epic. And that's Lord of the Rings, right? You give it that space. But in moderns, having that existing for decades and decades, modern fantasy's kind of departed from that. And I think the real effort nowadays in modern writing is to create these characters that we can connect with in the modern day. And we want to see people that are more complicated and more believable. And so I couldn't think of a better series that has better, more real characters than Saga. And the character that I chose from Saga is Alanna. So for those of you who may not know anything about what the heck I'm talking about, Alanna, who's once described as, quote, dim, impulsive, and kind of a slut, she's one of the main characters of Saga, which is an ongoing sci-fi fantasy graphic novel series, which was written by one of my favorite authors, just of all authors, Brian K. Vaughan, and then it was illustrated by Fiona Staples, who does an amazing job illustrating all the characters. And it's about a husband and wife, Alanna being the wife, and then her husband Marco, and they're from this long warring extraterrestrial races. They're on two sides, like Romeo and Juliet, and they're fleeing authorities from both sides of this galactic war as they're struggling to care for their daughter. They fall in love and they give birth to this child who's half Alanna's race, half Marco's race, and that's super controversial for the powers that be. Their child's birth defies the established order and essentially puts a target on their family's back from both sides of the war as they struggle just to make a normal life. And that's kind of the premise of this book. It's like, what if we told the story of Star Wars, but the main character was just some dude trying to survive on Tatooine and not Luke Skywalker. Like, Luke Skywalker might still exist, but there's also just this family that's trying just to not get blown up. So it's a really interesting point of view, and Alanna is the matriarch of the show. She's and what makes her so good is that she starts out as a soldier, and she has this love for reading, and she starts to read this romance novel that was a thinly veiled romance novel that was anti-war, and she meets a man on the opposite side. They fall in love. It's just like a really interesting premise. But what's interesting about Alanna is that she's so like normal and believable. She has her faults. She has her strengths. She's not necessarily good at anything. Like she's not like the daughter of the king of her world. She doesn't have any powers. She's not epic in any way. She's just trying to create a life for her family and for her daughter, which is a very realistic thing. She's super funny. She's got a strong libido, and she's very confident. She's very unapologetic, but she also is this hopeless romantic. Her compassion has gotten her in trouble in times, but I mean, she's in a loving relationship with her husband, but they go through their own problems. Like they go through this rough patch in their marriage, and they even, at one point they get knocked up again and she gets an abortion. It's like all these crazy things that are happening that would happen to a person in real life if you stick around with them long enough. It happens to Alanna, and I can't recommend that series enough. Not just to people that read graphic novels, but to people that just read works of fiction. It is truly that good. It transcends the issues that a lot of people have with just graphic novels in general. It's really just a masterful work of art. Like I love that series. I've reread those volumes multiple times, and every time I read about Alanna and Marco's relationship, it's like, man, these characters are more real than like a lot of nonfiction books I've read. It's just that much of a connection you have with the characters. And one of the quotes, like we were picking quotes, and I was like, what better quote for Alanna than the first book and the first volume, where it's a full page of just her face, and she goes, "Am I shitting? It feels like I'm shitting," which is like such an amazing way to set up this multi-volume epic. I mean, it's so fitting that Alanna's just like on this dirty table giving birth to her daughter and talking about that she feels like she's shitting. It's like such a crude, humorous line that sets up our expectations perfectly for how Saga plays out. It's so memorable, and it encapsulates her personality so well. It's just, when I think of Saga, like Alanna is one of the main core pieces of the themes of Saga. I can't recommend it highly enough.
You did an awesome job explaining what makes both Saga and Alanna so great. It really is that idea that it seems like a very real person who is caught up in all of this just wackiness, and I think it's such an amazing depiction of a mother as well. She's
Right.
got these very strong motherly instincts for protecting her daughter, and her daughter is basically this symbol for everything that both sides of this intergalactic war want to uh, get rid of.
Right.
And she's what's amazing is it really is this normal mother who not just wants to protect her child from the things that a typical mother has to protect their child from, but from two giant empires that want to destroy her child. And she's I don't know, she's a really incredible character because it feels like you know her, but she is in this crazy situation that
right. And I think you made a really interesting point by bringing up her motherhood. Like, she's a super interesting mom, and the whole idea of motherhood in fiction, it's a really interesting depiction of that alone, because yes, she has very strong maternal instincts, but she's also like this super punk chick, and she has problems with drugs, and she is not prepared in any way to be a mom. Like, leading up to it, no one thought highly of her at all except for her husband, and they would get into fights all the time, and she started working long hours and being absent in her relationship, and she has, she dyes her hair's dyed, and it's like it's not like, if you're gonna write a character that is a mom and like that's a huge part of her story, I've never read a character like this, and like, this is how moms really are. Like, they're not defined necessarily by being moms. They have these strong maternal instincts, but they still are their own person. And I think a huge theme of the show is it's like, we have a family to think about now, is what they say all the time, and their attitude towards that line changes throughout the show. Like, sometimes they get pissed when they say that to each other, sometimes graphic novel, and sometimes they latch on to that phrase, but it's always like, how do we think about our family? There's this traditional sense, and then there's the sense of just trying to exist and be yourselves. It's like truly amazing. Can't recommend Saga highly enough. Is there anything else you wanted to mention about these characters before we close it? I think we might actually do this, our 1 hour 10-minute goal here. We're sitting right at an hour 10 now.
Oh, that's a lot of pressure not to say anything.
If but you have something really
which
epic.
Is I don't have anything that epic. I'll just throw in that there's so many great characters in Saga, and Alanna is one of the best, and just one of them.
Right. There's so many characters I could have picked. Like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, like, so many characters I could have easily picked, but Alanna's like one of the main characters, and she so personifies what the series is about. And like, when I thought of the question, like, this idea of what I look for in a character, and this idea of this being real and believable, like, Alanna is so her own person and so real and so unique that I just had to pick her. But I highly recommend that series. I mean, all his characters are amazing.
There's no one like her.
No one like her. Yet there's many people that can relate to her at the same time. Nailed it. That's man, this was a really tough undertaking, not to mention that, we're not trying to ramble on, but I think we did it. I feel good about this. We covered 6 characters, 6 top tier characters for sure. I mean, we could have picked so many more. Like, there are so many honorable mentions out there. Maybe we'll just have to do this regularly. Come back to this question with new characters and just keep it spicy,
Character spotlight episodes.
Right.
Yeah.
And we may even have to go back to some of these characters again, because, like, man, I could just Let's just read let's just read the Tyrion chapters of Game of Thrones as a series.
Yeah, Charles, you're just spewing out content ideas during this episode.
Well, good thing we're recording. We'll have to go back and write some of this down. But yeah, this was your prompt, and I think it sparked a lot of good ideas. And I think for an episode 3, it was good to kind of give people a sense of where we stand in terms of what we like. And all said and done, this was a nice discussion. It got me excited to read more. Like, I really want to reread some of these things.
Do more buddy reading.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for listening. It has been our pleasure to talk with you all today about some of our favorite characters in fantasy. Be sure to check us out next week. We're going to talk about Book 2 of the Mistborn trilogy, Wells of Ascension. You don't want to miss it.
Continuing our buddy read of the Mistborn series.
That's right. It's our buddy reading episode. I don't know if we ever said this, but we're going to try and alternate between buddy reading episodes and just the general discussion episodes. So we did a buddy read last week. This is general discussion.
Charles,
buddy read next.
Isn't there something you want to tell them to do?
Man, Why, yes, there is something I want to tell them to do. Thank you for listening, and go forth and conquer, friends.
Nailed it.